$886 billion. That was the Pentagon's budget. And yet, somewhere between the F-35 delays, congressional procurement fights, and another PowerPoint presentation about future readiness, China built entire categories of military technology the United States either cannot currently match at scale or still hasn't deployed properly. That's the uncomfortable part. The bigger problem is that this didn't happen secretly. Beijing published most of it in journals, trade expos, satellite launches, naval exercises, and procurement announcements. The signals were visible for years. Washington just kept assuming the gap would remain permanent because historically it always had. Then the assumptions stopped working. A decade ago, the dominant view inside the American defense establishment was simple. China could copy technology, manufacture cheaply, and overwhelm markets with volume, but it couldn't innovate fast enough to threaten the US military at the high end. The cutting edge would remain American, especially in aerospace, naval systems, AI-enabled warfare, hypersonics, and advanced missile integration. That belief aged badly. By 2025, the Pentagon itself had quietly admitted China was ahead in several critical defense sectors, especially shipbuilding capacity, certain hypersonic systems, electronic warfare integration, and industrial-scale drone manufacturing. Not hypothetically ahead, operationally ahead. And this matters far beyond military nerd arguments on defense forums, because military technology isn't isolated anymore. The same industrial ecosystem that builds autonomous targeting systems also builds semiconductor supply chains, AI accelerators, rare earth refining capacity, advanced batteries, quantum sensors, and satellite networks. Military competition leaks into civilian power, into jobs, into trade, into who controls the infrastructure of the next economy. That's why this story feels bigger than missiles. Take shipbuilding for a second. The United States still builds extraordinary warships. The problem is tempo. China's shipyards, particularly under the state-owned China State Shipbuilding Corporation, now produce naval tonnage at a pace the U.S. simply cannot replicate without restructuring its industrial base almost from scratch. One estimate from the U.S. Naval Institute suggested China's shipbuilding capacity exceeds America's by more than 200 times commercially. 200. That number sounds fake until you realize how much manufacturing America outsourced during the post-Cold War decades, while assuming globalized supply chains would remain stable forever. History tends to punish forever. And the strange thing is that America still has enormous advantages. Better alliances, better combat experience, stronger submarine technology, more sophisticated military aviation in several areas. The issue isn't that China surpassed the US everywhere. It absolutely hasn't. The issue is narrower and, in some ways, more dangerous. China identified specific bottlenecks in American military planning and built systems designed to exploit them directly. Not parity, pressure points. Hypersonic glide vehicles that complicate carrier defense calculations. Cheap autonomous drones that threaten billion-dollar platforms, anti-ship ballistic missiles designed specifically around Pacific geography, electronic warfare systems optimized for disrupting satellite-dependent operations, industrial manufacturing depth that allows faster replacement during prolonged conflict. This wasn't random modernization, it was targeted adaptation. And honestly, some of the American reaction bordered on denial. For years, reports describing Chinese advances were treated almost like political theater, something lawmakers cited during budget negotiations before returning to procurement systems that still move at Cold War speed. The Pentagon can spend tens of billions developing a next-generation platform before realizing the battlefield evolved halfway through production. China noticed that, then built around it. One of the strangest examples came from drone warfare. While American defense contractors focused heavily on exquisite systems with massive cost structures, Chinese firms like DJI quietly dominated global commercial drone manufacturing. At one point, DJI controlled roughly 70% of the world market, a consumer drone company, which sounds harmless until modern warfare suddenly becomes saturated with cheap aerial surveillance and autonomous strike adaptation. Ukraine made that brutally obvious. So did the Red Sea attacks. Warfare started drifting toward mass-produced systems while the U.S. procurement ecosystem still preferred handcrafted luxury weapons with congressional districts attached to them. The future showed up before the bureaucracy finished its meeting schedule. And before people say, well, America still spends more than the next 10 countries combined. Yes, that's true. But raw spending is becoming a misleading metric if large portions disappear into maintenance, healthcare obligations, contractor overhead, legacy systems, and procurement delays stretching 10 or 15 years. Money matters. Industrial velocity matters more. Because this isn't just about who builds the best weapons anymore. It's about who can redesign them faster during an actual conflict. Who can absorb losses? Who can replace destroyed systems in months instead of years? And buried inside all of this is a question Washington still hasn't answered clearly. What happens if the world's most expensive military entered an era optimized for speed instead of perfection? There's a tendency in Washington to explain China's military rise as if it appeared automatically once the country became richer. That's too simplistic. Wealth helped, but strategy mattered more. The real shift began after the 1991 Gulf War. Chinese military analysts watched the United States dismantle Saddam Hussein's army with a level of precision that looked almost unreal at the time. GPS-guided strikes, stealth aircraft, real-time battlefield coordination, space-enabled warfare. American commanders could see, communicate, and hit targets faster than opponents could even process what was happening. For Beijing, it was a warning disguised as a demonstration. The lesson China took from the Gulf War was not, build the same military as America. The lesson was, never allow America to fight the kind of war it prefers. That distinction shaped almost everything that followed. Instead of trying to mirror the US globally, China concentrated on the Western Pacific. Geography became part of the weapon system. The People's Liberation Army Rocket Force developed anti-access and area denial doctrines specifically around making intervention near Taiwan brutally expensive. Not impossible, expensive enough to introduce hesitation. That's a different goal. And once you understand that, a lot of China's technology decisions suddenly make more sense. The DF-21D anti-ship ballistic missile is the famous example, often called the carrier killer. Some analysts argue its real-world effectiveness remains unproven, which is fair. Combat reveals truths PowerPoint slides hide. But even uncertainty changes planning. If U.S. carrier groups must operate farther from contested zones because commanders cannot fully trust defensive interception rates, China already altered the battlefield before firing anything. That's the thing about modern military competition. You don't always need perfect systems. Sometimes you just need systems capable of forcing caution. The same logic appears in hypersonics. America still possesses extraordinary missile technology, but China moved unusually fast integrating hypersonic glide vehicles into operational testing. The DF-17 became symbolic because it represented something deeper than one missile platform. Beijing was compressing development cycles, while the Pentagon remained trapped inside procurement systems designed for another era. In 2021, reports emerged that China tested a fractional orbital bombardment system paired with a hypersonic glide vehicle. Even some American defense officials seemed surprised by how advanced the test appeared. Others pushed back, saying the media exaggerated it. Both things can be true. The coverage probably was dramatic. The capability was still serious. And here's where the conversation gets uncomfortable for the United States. Because the problem isn't isolated technologies, it's integration speed across sectors. China doesn't separate civilian and military industry the same way America does. Under its military-civil fusion strategy, companies, universities, AI labs, semiconductor firms, quantum research centers, and manufacturing networks can be pulled into national strategic objectives with a level of coordination Western democracies often struggle to replicate. That creates inefficiencies and political risks, absolutely. Centralized systems always have blind spots, but it also creates speed. A private American company can spend years negotiating contracts, compliance rules, congressional approvals, export reviews, environmental assessments, and inter-service budget fights before production even scales. China can simply decide. Not always wisely, but quickly. There's a reason Beijing surged ahead in certain drone categories while America kept debating procurement doctrine. Chinese manufacturers were iterating hardware at commercial speed, thousands of units, constant redesigns, real-world testing through export markets. Meanwhile, parts of the Pentagon still treated drones like supplementary tools rather than battlefield infrastructure. Then Ukraine happened. Suddenly, $500 commercial quadcopters were helping destroy multi-million-dollar armored vehicles. FPV drones turned trench warfare into something between World War I and science fiction. Cheap systems began exhausting expensive interceptors. Military planners everywhere had to confront an ugly economic equation. If a $30,000 drone can threaten a $10 million platform, scale changes the math of war. China had already been preparing for scale. And this is where people misunderstand the 41 technologies argument. It doesn't necessarily mean China built 41 miracle weapons America has never heard of. Some categories are narrow, some remain disputed. Others involve manufacturing dominance rather than technological superiority. But collectively, they point towards something real. China's defense ecosystem became frighteningly good at identifying the future's cost curves. That's a different kind of military advantage. One RAND analysis years ago warned that the United States increasingly optimized for high-performance systems at low production volume, while China optimized for acceptable performance at industrial volume. At the time, that sounded like a compromise. Today, it looks more like strategic forecasting. Because wars consume inventory faster than peacetime planners imagine, Russia learned that in Ukraine. Europe learned it after emptying artillery stockpiles. America quietly learned it when defense officials realized certain precision-guided munitions would become difficult to replenish quickly during a prolonged Pacific conflict. Industrial war is back. Nobody in the globalization era really wanted to believe that. And there's another layer most discussions miss. China's leadership studied not just American military victories, but American political behavior. They noticed that the U.S. public tolerates short wars far better than long ones. They noticed budget fights, election cycles, congressional paralysis, strategic impatience. They noticed how Afghanistan and Iraq drained attention, money, and manufacturing focus for 20 years. Beijing was watching the machinery, not just the missiles. Which raises a harder question than whether China can match America technologically. Can democratic systems still sustain long-term industrial competition against a state willing to coordinate its economy around strategic objectives for decades at a time? Because that answer affects a lot more than Taiwan. But there's another side to this story that gets buried under the panic. China's military rise looks smoother from a distance than it does up close. The People's Liberation Army has not fought a major war since 1979. Its modern officer corps lacks large-scale combat experience. Corruption investigations inside the rocket force and defense procurement system have removed senior officials at exactly the moment Beijing is trying to project competence. And despite all the headlines about Chinese manufacturing power, some of the most advanced components in high-end semiconductors, jet engines, and precision tooling still depend on choke points outside China's full control. That matters. Because military technology is one thing, military reliability under stress is something else entirely. The United States learned that the hard way across decades of combat. Expensive mistakes, painful adaptation, but also institutional memory. American logistics networks, naval coordination, submarine operations, and alliance integration were built through real operations under real pressure. China has simulated much of this. The U.S. has lived it. And before anyone turns this into a simple "America still wins" argument, hold that thought for a second, because the reversal here is uncomfortable for both sides. America may still possess the stronger military overall. I think it probably does, especially once you factor alliances into the equation. Japan, South Korea, Australia, NATO intelligence coordination, Pacific basing structures. China doesn't operate inside that kind of global network. But modern conflicts are not scored like boxing matches. You don't need to become stronger everywhere. You need to become dangerous enough in one specific theater that intervention itself starts looking uncertain. That's the shift. And Taiwan sits directly in the middle of it. A war over Taiwan would occur roughly 100 miles from China's coastline and around 7,000 miles from the continental United States. Geography isn't just background scenery and military planning. It determines fuel requirements, missile ranges, repair cycles, satellite angles, shipping vulnerability, pilot fatigue, submarine persistence, everything. China built for the map it expects to fight on. The United States built for global reach. Usually, global reach is an enormous advantage. In this case, it creates strain. One Pentagon war game after another has produced versions of the same warning. Even if the U.S. ultimately prevails in a Taiwan conflict, losses could be catastrophic. Ships, aircraft, missile inventories, satellites, industrial depletion on a scale Americans haven't psychologically prepared for since the Second World War. That's partly why the drone issue matters so much. People still instinctively imagine great power war through images of aircraft carriers and stealth bombers. Those systems still matter enormously. But increasingly, military planners are confronting a future where autonomy, AI-assisted targeting, low-cost swarms, cyber disruption, and industrial replacement speed shape outcomes just as heavily as elite platforms. And this is where China's manufacturing depth becomes more than an economic statistic. In 2024, China produced over half the world's commercial ships. It dominates rare earth processing. It controls huge portions of battery supply chains and industrial materials refinement. Even where the technology itself originated elsewhere, China often controls scaling capacity. That creates strategic endurance. Wars are not won by prototypes. They're won by replacement cycles. The United States is beginning to recognize this, which explains the sudden urgency around reshoring semiconductor production through the CHIPS Act, rebuilding naval shipyards, expanding munitions manufacturing, and strengthening supply chain resilience with allies like Japan and the Netherlands. But rebuilding industrial ecosystems takes time, sometimes decades. Factories are easier to close than recreate. And honestly, some of America's recent defense behavior looks like a country waking up halfway through the exam. The Pentagon launched the Replicator Initiative partly because officials realized cheap autonomous systems were evolving faster than traditional procurement timelines could handle. Silicon Valley defense startups suddenly became fashionable in Washington after years of skepticism toward commercial sector integration. A little late, maybe, but not irrelevant. Because the U.S. still has enormous innovative capacity once it decides something matters strategically. That's historically been America's real strength, not permanent efficiency, but the ability to mobilize suddenly when pressure becomes undeniable. The question is whether the political system still recognizes pressure early enough. There's also a deeper misunderstanding embedded in a lot of commentary about China's 41 unmatched technologies. People hear that phrase and imagine a science fiction leap where America became obsolete overnight. That's not reality. Some Chinese systems are superior. Some are roughly equivalent. Some are exaggerated by both Chinese state media and American defense hawks who benefit from larger budgets. Fear can become its own industry. The more important truth is subtler. China forced the United States into a competition it didn't fully prepare for, one centered less on individual weapons and more on industrial adaptation speed. That's harder to measure on television graphics. There's no dramatic unveiling ceremony for supply chain resilience, no cinematic soundtrack behind rare earth refining capacity. But prolonged competition tends to expose boring advantages before glamorous ones. Britain learned that during the industrial era. The Soviet Union learned it during the Cold War. Germany learned it twice, disastrously. Military prestige matters. Industrial stamina decides what survives after the prestige burns off. And there's one detail from the opening worth returning to: the $886 billion figure. Because if a country spends nearly $1 trillion a year on defense yet still fears losing key production races, then the issue probably isn't just spending levels anymore. It's what the system rewards. And this is where the conversation stops being about China for a minute. Because the real warning buried inside all of this is about institutional drift. The United States still has extraordinary scientists, engineers, universities, defense labs, aerospace companies, and military personnel. Nobody serious doubts that. If this were purely a competition of raw talent, America would remain terrifyingly strong. The issue is that modern competition increasingly rewards coordination as much as innovation. That's newer territory for the U.S. For roughly 30 years after the Cold War, America operated under the assumption that technological superiority was permanent. The Soviet Union collapsed, globalization expanded, Wall Street prioritized efficiency over redundancy, and manufacturing moved abroad because nobody imagined industrial capacity itself would become a strategic weapon again. China did. Beijing looked at the same global system and saw dependence as leverage. Rare earth refining, battery materials, commercial shipbuilding, drone manufacturing, telecommunications infrastructure, semiconductor packaging. Piece by piece, sectors that seemed boring or low margin became geopolitical pressure points later. The irony is almost painful. America spent years treating manufacturing like an outdated economic category, while China treated it like national security with assembly lines attached. And to be fair, Washington is adjusting, slowly. The CHIPS and Science Act, export controls on advanced semiconductors, expanded Pacific alliances, AUKUS submarine coordination, munitions production increases. These are signs the U.S. finally understands the competition is structural, not temporary. But structural problems don't disappear because a committee writes a strategy paper. One Pentagon official said something a few years ago that stuck with me. He argued the U.S. defense ecosystem became optimized for producing perfect systems in peacetime quantities. That sentence explains an uncomfortable amount about modern American military procurement. Perfection is expensive, wars are chaotic, and attrition doesn't care how advanced your brochure looks. Meanwhile, China's leadership appears willing to tolerate inefficiency, duplication, and even massive debt if those costs produce strategic manufacturing depth. Western economists often look at that model and see distortions. They're not wrong. China absolutely has debt problems, property bubbles, demographic decline, and serious internal vulnerabilities. But military planners don't get to analyze only weaknesses. They have to analyze capabilities as they exist. That's the difference between political comfort and strategic reality. Personally, I think a lot of commentary swings too far in both directions. One side acts like China is 10 feet tall and inevitable. The other still treats Chinese advances like inflated propaganda that collapses under scrutiny. Reality is more complicated, and probably more dangerous precisely because of that complexity. China doesn't need total military dominance to reshape the Pacific balance. It just needs enough capability to make American intervention uncertain, expensive, and politically divisive. That threshold is much lower than global supremacy. And honestly, I'm not fully convinced Washington emotionally understands the scale of the transition yet. You can see signs of recognition, absolutely. But parts of the American political system still behave like the country has unlimited time to rebuild industrial capacity, reform procurement, train engineers, secure supply chains, and prepare for prolonged strategic competition. History is usually less patient than that. My prediction? The next decade will not look like a new Cold War. Cold Wars had clearer boundaries. This will look messier. Constant technological races, supply chain pressure campaigns, AI competition, naval standoffs, semiconductor disruption, cyber disruption, satellite vulnerability, industrial espionage, and proxy economic warfare happening simultaneously. Not one giant collision, a permanent stress test. And the strange part is that the final outcome may depend less on who invents the most advanced weapon, and more on which system can keep adapting after the first plan fails. Because the first plan always fails. That's been true in every major conflict humans have ever fought. Military history is basically a museum of confident assumptions catching fire. If you made it this far, you already know this story was never really about 41 technologies. It was about speed, and whether democracies still remember how to move before the pressure becomes unavoidable.